Now let's talk a little bit about oligopoly. So oligopoly is a market structure where there are a few firms. We've talked about perfect competition, which has many firms, and we've talked about monopoly, where the industry is the firm. There's only one firm in the industry. And so oligopoly is in between, where there are a few firms, and they strategically interact with each other. That is one of the characteristics of oligopoly. And we'll also talk a little bit about, or some of our examples will be a form of oligopoly known as duopoly, where there are two firms in the entire industry. So first of all, let's just talk about how competitive an industry has to be, or uncompetitive it has to be considered an oligopoly. There's a measure of market concentration called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, which is used by the government actually to determine whether a market is competitive or not. And the formula for the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index is you take all of the firms in the industry and look at their market share, and then you square their market share and then you add it. And that sum then becomes the index. So let's think of an example. If we had an industry that only had 3 firms, one of which had a 50% market share, and the other 2 each had 25. So this would be the concentration, and of course we're always going to add up to 100. The entire market is represented by these 3 firms. And then we square each of these numbers. So 50 squared, of course, is 2,500, and 25 squared is 625. And so the sum of these 3 is 3750. And so for an industry that has 3 firms, one of which has 50% of the market and each of the other 2 has 25% each, the index is 3750. The government, the Justice Department, which is responsible for enforcing the antitrust laws and determining whether an industry is competitive or not, basically use a rule of thumb that below 1,000 is considered strongly competitive. If it's 1,000 to 1,800, it's considered somewhat competitive. And if it's over 1,800, it's an oligopoly. So clearly, in this industry that uses an example, would be clearly well into the oligopoly range. We could think of a different kind of market, which might have 7 firms, 3 of which had, say, 20% each, and the other 4 had 10% each. And this would have, so this would be 400. We square these numbers, and then 100, 100, 100, 100. And so the sum here would be 1,600. And so this, so if you had an industry that had 7 firms, 3 of which had 20% market share each, and the other 4 each had 10% of the market, the index would be 1,600. And so you would be getting close to the oligopoly range, but actually be in the somewhat competitive range. If any 2 of these firms would decide to merge, however, it might push the industry into the 1,800 range. And so the Justice Department would probably frown on any mergers within this industry because it's so close to the line that it might become an oligopoly if any 2 of these firms were to merge. One of the issues that the Justice Department has to consider when determining whether an industry is an oligopoly, of course, is the definition of the industry. And so one of the examples that's in the textbook, which is actually quite interesting, was the proposed merger between Whole Foods and Wild Oats, the 2 big natural food grocery stores. Justice Department opposed this because they claimed that that each of them had such a large dominant share of the market for natural foods. They, of course, opposed it by saying a couple of things. One, that natural foods are available in a variety of stores. It isn't just Whole Foods or Wild Oats. You can go to any grocery store and find natural and organic foods. And also you might argue that they're really not in their own industry, but they're actually in the grocery industry, which is obviously got many, many players and many firms. And sure, they have this niche of organic food, but they're really part of this overall large industry, and so the two firms within that overall large industry were to merge, it wouldn't create an oligopoly. So that's a question for the courts to decide. Market, of course, we're going to have a downward sloping demand curve. And let's say we had two firms that had gotten together and made a deal that they were going to maximize their profits by, say, charging a price of 5. We'll use my classic example of demand curve that goes from 11.0 to 0.11. And so let's say the two firms decided they would each charge a price of 5. They would each produce 3. And so the total quantity for the market would be 6. And you could think about one firm producing 3 and the other firm producing the other 3. So if if this was a monopoly, the marginal revenue, right, of going from 5 to 4, right, there would be a price effect, which would be, so if the price falls from 5 to 4, the price effect would be that for these 5 items, we're charging $1 less, and there would be a quantity effect that for this additional item we would get $4. So overall, the net revenue change of going from a price of 5 to a price of 4 would be -1, right? So the total effect would be -1. So of course, even if we assume marginal cost of 0, no firm would want to increase production from 6 to 7 and lower the price from 5 to 4 if it was a monopoly, because the negative price effect would be larger than the positive quantity effect. But let's say we were back to our firms, our oligopoly, and they had some sort of a deal where they each had agreed to produce 3 each. Well, then any individual firm of these two would have an incentive to cheat, because if they were so let's say for the market we're producing 6, but each individual firm is producing 3, and they're charging the price of 5, and so that would be a total revenue of 15. But if this individual firm were to increase its production to 4, assuming that the other firm kept the deal and produced 3, then the quantity would fall to 7. The quantity would increase to 7, the price would fall to 4, and so for the individual firm, the price effect, of course, would be -1 times the 3 that we were producing before, but the quantity effect would be that we would get this additional $4 on this additional 1, so the quantity effect would be +1 for the firm, and +4 for the firm, so the total effect would be a +1. So this firm would have an incentive to cheat and lower the price to, increase production to 4, which would in effect lower the price to 4 for the market. Of course, the other person, or the other firm in this deal, of course, would really lose out, because they had produced the 3 expecting to sell them for 5, which would be 15, and of course, they see the price has fallen to 4, so they're only going to get $12 because of the cheating done by their competitor that they thought was their collaborator. So this sets up the idea that when we are in an oligopoly situation where the firms are acting strategically, they're often in a situation that we call a prisoner's dilemma.